Everyone. My name is Scott Marcus. I'm going to be your moderator today, and welcome to the session. It's going to be about COVID-19 and an accelerated shift to working from home. We'll be particularly looking at contrast and similarities between the situation in Europe versus that in the United States of America. We have a quite exceptional group of speakers assembled for today, very experienced speakers. You're going to be hearing from Mamta Kapoor, who's the Europe Research and Thought Leadership lead at Talent and Organization Human Potential from Accenture, a worldwide organization, consultancy. This is really her meat, her bread and butter. You're going to be hearing from Professor Jose Maria Barrero. He's an Tom, a very prestigious Mexican university. He also is the author, together with Bloom and Davis, of a very fine paper that assesses the situation in the United States, one in fact that I quote extensively in my own work. You're also going to be hearing from Laura Nursky, who's one of my colleagues here at Bruegel. She specializes in future of work issues. She's running a parallel study to this one on behalf of the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. Now, I would like to let you know this is basically an interactive panel in the sense that you will be able to ask questions using Slido. Also, those of you accessing us from the events page will see that there's an opportunity to enter questions directly on the events page. I also have a handful of questions that were already entered. Those of you using Slido, the code is #WFH, as in work from home. And with that, if you could please be so kind as to put up the slides and we can get into this. So clearly, in the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, there we go, in the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, the ability to work from home has really been our salvation. At a time when restrictions were implemented, it's the thing that enabled us to continue to work more or less normally. Now, are the slides up here? I don't actually see them. Are we good? Okay, I'll assume that things are going, and I'll move along. So this is actually a first output from a transatlantic expert group on the future of work. Good. And the transatlantic expert group is comprised of some 30 very diverse interdisciplinary experts assembled from both sides of the Atlantic, about half and half. We're automation, artificial intelligence, digitalization, and our topic for today, which is the shift to working from home. The TEG was brought together, the Transatlantic Expert Group was brought together by Bruegel together with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. It benefits from funding from the European Union, specifically flowing through the European External Action Service. So essentially a lot of what we're trying, EU-US comparisons, similarities, differences. What I'll be touching on today, first is new technology as an enabler for work from home, its impact on productivity, the likely evolution when working from home is no longer mandated as a result of the pandemic, distributional effects, health and well-being of the workers, clearly a key theme, the implications for urban areas, and the implications for policy in general, public policy in particular. So clearly, the shift to work from home has been hugely helpful during the pandemic. The basic technology, though, is not new. Systems like Zoom, systems like the one that we're using right now, they've improved over the last 2 years, but most of this technology was already there. Work from home was already possible. I was doing a lot of work from home before the pandemic. Why did we not see a more dramatic transition earlier? In fact, there was growth, but it was very slow growth, glacial growth. So why didn't this happen a long time ago? Well, it's fairly clear that even though workers wanted to be able to work from home, they cherished the flexibility that that could give them. At the same time, managers at this point, because of that, we can expect that a post-pandemic, if we can speak of post-pandemic world, will look different than that today. One interesting aside, technology clearly plays a role. Traffic on the internet did go up 40, 50%, depending on whose estimates you look at. But contrary to some predictions, the internet did not collapse. It held up pretty doggone well. Now, to look at the growth of tech indicators, the graph here shows the growth in the use of Zoom by Macintosh users, as it happens. This comes from a Macintosh application. But what you see is a growth factor 20 over just a small number of months. So clearly, we're in a different world than we were before the pandemic. As far as productivity, the results are not entirely definitive, but they're pretty clear. And by the way, Professor Bruegel is going to be talking about this quite a bit. Workers tend to think that they are more productive when they're working from home. Managers, maybe not so sure. The hours worked per day, though, this is a clear result. Workers are working more hours per day when they work from home. Is this bad for the workers? Yes and no. They're saving time on the commute, so the net time worked may not actually have increased, but a lot of the time that they into doing more work or else into going into non-leisure time activities at home. Meanwhile, one result, this is from Brynjolfsson and Petropoulos, is that labor productivity, which had been largely stagnant in a lot of developed countries, seems to have shot up in the United States in the first quarter of 2021. So essentially, we're seeing productivity gains probably not just from work from home, but also from its integration with artificial intelligence, digitalization in general. Now, as far as what's likely to happen in a more normal world, it's important to remember what we have today is a crisis-driven arrangement, and things aren't working quite the way they would in more normal circumstances. Caregivers, for example, still have kids at home who may not be able to go to school. Clearly a different world. But surveys in both the United States and the EU make quite clear workers would like to continue to work from home. They also make clear that hybrid work from home, let's say 2-3 days a week, is going to be by far the prevalent pattern. And this was actually true before the pandemic. We've already had some very good studies that look at teleworkability, the amenability of work to work from home in different kinds of jobs, different sectors. And what this shows is big differences. Managers, professionals, technicians, clerical support workers, a lot of those could be working from home. Laura's going to be talking more about this shortly. But not all of them do. Realized potential. The pandemic forced us to enable those who could work from home to do so. It really shot up. There are a lot of other workers, though. Think about agricultural workers, fishery workers, bus drivers, retail, healthcare workers. They mostly have to be where the work is. These are jobs that, at least today, are less amenable to work from home. One other factor that plays in here is the Great Resignation. There's been much more discussion of that in the United States than Europe. A tendency for people to leave work. Actually, a very nice paper by Jason Furman suggests that the rate of departure from jobs isn't that unusual given the job scarcity, labor scarcity and high salaries at the moment. The surprising bit is that people aren't re-entering the job market as quickly as historically was the case. Now, here you have a graph. Laura will talk a little more about this, but it emphasizes the point I just made. The blue is the degree to which telework could be possible, the brown degree to which it was actually happening before the pandemic. And what you see is that for managers and professionals, a lot of that could have been done from home, but was not until it had to be. Even more extreme if you look at clerical support workers. But all of these other categories like craft and trade workers, plant workers, machine operators, other elementary occupations, think about people who clean the room, those are not amenable today to work from home. Okay, moving right along, distributional effects. Who benefits? Well, over the 10 years before the pandemic, it was abundantly clear, both in the US and in Europe, a lot of the work from home was going to people in the highest income quantiles. Those were the ones that had the opportunity. It was almost like a bonus, like an employment perk for high-skilled workers. Those in the lower quantiles had very few opportunities to work from home, even if they were in jobs that potentially could have been amenable. Now, the growth of work from home may contribute to even further income disparity. Again, Laura's going to be looking into this in more detail, but there's good reason to fear this, both because of these income effects, also because digital skills are so critical to the ability to work from home. What we've also seen in the pandemic is a tendency for women to be particularly, maybe not all women. Remember, women may very well benefit from being able to work at home where they weren't able to before. However, women with caregiving responsibilities, especially in an era where children often were at home where they otherwise would have been at school, they seem to have suffered. And note, a statistic from the European Union is that women spend an average of 39 hours a week taking care of children compared to 21 hours by men. So this is a real driver. 39 hours per week is a lot. Statistics from Eurofound, which is a European labor institute, here what you see, the bottom categories relate to women, some women with children under 12, some women without children under 12, but all of the bottom categories are red, all of the top categories are green, all of the bottom categories are female, all of the top categories are male. This tells us something. Moving along, so health and well-being of those who are working from home is another concern. Again, the savings in commute time isn't translating directly into more leisure time. A lot of that saved time is spent either at work or doing non-leisure activities at home. We're also seeing a blurring of the difference between private time versus work time, and for managers also, they may not really respect the private time of their workers. So this becomes an issue and really may be contributing to additional stress for workers who are working at home. There are also some indications of a decline in mental well-being, and again, especially for those with caregiving responsibilities. Now, at the outset, there'd been expectations that the cities were going to empty out, that New York was going to become a ghost town. This was probably much more of a discussion in the United States than in Europe. Actually, one of the newspaper articles in the Times said nobody's talking about Paris being dead. But in the US, it's sort of linked with a long for cities like New York and San Francisco to lose population, but mostly there is a fair bit of data for the United States. Mostly the cities that are losing population are the same cities that were already losing population. There was a slight acceleration, nothing anywhere near as dramatic as what was anticipated. And that makes sense. The data also suggests that much of the movement is that people are moving slightly further away from the same cities that they were all working in, essentially moving to exurban rather than suburban areas. If they're going to work only a couple of days a week instead of every day, that kind of makes sense. They still need to be within reasonable range of the city, but not quite as close as they historically were. So what we're really trying to do here, this paper was pulling together a lot of results from existing research. It's not primary research per se, but what we were trying to do was to synthesize a lot of the results and based on that to extract policy conclusions. And some of the key issues that we take away, first off, there's an issue for workers. Workers are going to have to be very much aware of the changing workplace, not only due to work from home, also due to artificial intelligence, due to digitalization, globalization, you name it. All of those call for a more flexible response. They also call for training, especially training in digital skills. For managers, there's going to be a clear need to adapt their practices. They can't manage quite the way that they historically did. Their management of knowledge workers is going to have to be much more focused on results orientation rather than hours worked. Social partners like trade unions, historically, a lot of their growth was driven by workers who saw each other every day. Well, they're in a world that's highly digitized, highly impacted by artificial intelligence, and where much work is conducted from the home. So those change as well. For policymakers, there are several key takeaways. They're going to have to look at these distributional effects. They're going to have to protect work-life balance, and they're going to have to ensure that these shifts don't intrude needlessly into social protection. And this in a world, by the way, where many other trends were leading to challenges with social protection, traditional employment, towards self-employment and toward non-traditional forms of employment. So there's work to be done here for the policymakers. Clearly the shift to work from home favors those with high skills, high education, lots of digital skills. Caregivers have carried a special burden, continue, I think, to carry a special burden, even in a supposed a right to disconnect may be needed, and some countries are already beginning to enact this into law. Finally, social protection is probably going to need further modernization as we go forward. Now, with that concludes my remarks. I'd like to switch now to Mamta Kapoor of Accenture. I would very much like to hear her remarks. I think she's going to be telling us, among other things, what the implications are for businesses and for managers. To you, Mamta. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Scott. It's a pleasure to be a part of this panel. I'd like to take you all through some recent findings from Accenture's Future of Work Thought Leadership Program. If my slides could be pulled up, please. I'm not able to see the slides yet. Great, thank you. So I think all of you would agree with me when I say that the pandemic and the social upheaval over the last 2 years has changed work forever. Could we please go to the next slide? It has fundamentally changed people's relationship with work and how it fits in their lives, what it means to be a worker. And I'm sure we've all experienced it to some level in our own lives as we were working remotely. Now we know that before COVID-19, for 90% of the global workforce, the norm was for them to go on site, to go to a location, to go to a place of work. So that's the reason majority of our current understanding of workers, of workplace, of nature of work is based on on-site workers. And that's the reason there are a lot of unknowns right now. A lot of questions are being asked. And number one question everyone is asking right now is, what would work look like in the future? In fact, if you look at the next slide, organizations are grappling with a lot of other questions around what work models to use. How do you optimize technology workspaces? But what we find is that most organizations are still stuck in the dialogue around location, around places. How would return to office look like? We notice that companies are making a big push to return to normal. They're investing efforts in designing policies, in designing approaches to bring people back into office. But I think majority missed this important point that the old normal no longer exists. And in fact, have you even considered how likely it is that workers even want to return on site? So to better understand some of these worker sentiments and their mindset, we conducted a survey of over 9,000 workers across 11 countries in March of 2021. In fact, we're currently working on wave 2 of this research, where we've just got the data back from the field and we are analyzing it. We plan to launch the findings in the next couple of weeks. And at that point, I'd be very happy to report back to this group with what we found. But for the moment, let me walk you through some of the interesting findings from this research. Next slide, please. The first question we tried to answer was, where do people want to work? And here is what we found on the next slide. Hybrid is the future of work. 83% of people who we surveyed said hybrid work model would be optimal in the future. The reality is that 58% of workers we surveyed have already been working in hybrid work environments to some extent. And how we define hybrid is workers who work remotely at least 25 to 75% of this time. So the next important question is, what makes hybrid work so popular. To put it simply, it's the best of both worlds. It turns out that people who had a hybrid work model during the pandemic, these 58% of workers that I'm talking about, were the ones who had the best mental health, who had the strongest work relationships, and who had the best net better off scores. They also experienced less burnout. But the reality is not everyone can be hybrid. Could we please go to the next slide? I think we've gone back. Next slide, please. So when I say why not everyone can be hybrid is because for a lot of workers, it is mandatory to be on site. It has been a part of their contract. It is conditional to their employment. And from our survey sample, about 25% of workers we surveyed continue to die throughout the pandemic and for the foreseeable future. Many of these individuals are likely to be from healthcare and retail industries, so frontline workers. Some of them work at lower organizational levels and working for smaller and more localized businesses. So when we are redesigning work, I think it's very important to keep in mind that we do not leave these on-site workers behind. We need to optimize their work experience too and ensure that these people feel productive, they feel healthy, they feel they have an opportunity to thrive as well as other workers. Now, the next important question is, how are people feeling about work today? If we could please go to the next slide. Next slide. So we conducted some statistical cluster analysis on the worker data, and we found 4 clusters emerging. So 1 in 3 workers, so about 31% of the sample, are unfortunately feeling disgruntled. So these are workers who are highly pessimistic, they're fatigued, they're not feeling well about their work. Another 15% are apathetic. They're going through the motions, but they don't feel overly positive, they don't feel overly negative, they're just surviving and getting through the day. And then if you look at the far right-hand side, we see 42% of people are thriving. Now that's a silver lining because this means that these are workers who are filled with optimism, who are filled with energy. But having said that, we have a big group in the middle who are undecided, who are not sure at the moment whether they're going to be positive or negative about the place of work. And therefore, the businesses have a big task ahead of them to really figure out, how do you mobilize this group? How do you move this disgruntled group of workers into the more positive side of the spectrum so that they can be more healthy and productive no matter where they work? Going to the next slide, we found, interestingly, that technology is a key driver remote. So I think Scott also just touched upon this aspect. Many people prefer to work on site for a better tech experience. Also, we found that many employees who prefer to work remotely are the ones who said that they can be productive remotely just because their organization has provided them with the right techs and tools. So it's really important in hybrid work environments. If you want to be successful, if you want your workers to thrive, you need to get the tech right. So we found that what's driving people to choose whether to work on-site and remotely, the drivers are dramatically different. There were certain other drivers which I'd like to mention. For instance, for working remotely, it included safety, quality of life, freedom to take more productive breaks. And when it came to working on-site, apart from technology, it included factors like people's interactions. So many people said that working remotely, they used to miss those interactions they were having with their colleagues and the benefits they got from being into a routine. That's why I think it's time to take a step back and think, are we focusing on the right question? Is the real question around education, or instead we should focus on a longer term question, which is probably more interesting and has a longer shelf life, which is around what will it take to unleash people's full potential, enabling them to be healthy and productive regardless of where they work. So we asked this very interesting question to our respondents. Going to the next slide, we found very interestingly an emerging profile of workers whom we like to call productive anywhere group, which was about 40% of our survey sample, who said whether they're on-site or remote. And interestingly, if you look at the geographic spread, workers in US, the number is much higher for workers in US as compared to other geos. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we also found a small segment of workers, small yet very important, 8% of our sample, felt they couldn't be efficient or healthy anywhere. there was something at their workplace which was just not right, which was not allowing them to be productive or healthy, whether they were working remotely or on site. So we really wanted to, as researchers, we really wanted to understand what's really separating these two groups in our sample. So we immediately looked at the stress levels, the burnout levels, the microaggression levels experienced. And to our surprise, that's not where the answer lies. It was very interesting that even these 40% of productive anywhere workers were experiencing the same level of stress, were experiencing the same level of fatigue and burnout. We clicked into this group and found that it's actually the access to the right people and organizational resources, which is the game changer. Having the support of personal and organizational resources is what separates people who can't be productive anywhere for people who can be productive anywhere. On the next slide, please, I'd like to just spend a minute talking about what these resources are. Next slide, please. So we can categorize these resources into two groups, personal and organizational. So if you look at the personal, these were workers who had autonomy at job, who had a choice. We know people want to have this freedom of choice in their job, no matter where they're working. These are people who had positive mental health. They had resources to enable productive lives. They have desire to participate in learning. They're really excited to learn new skills. They have a growth mindset and are able to engage in learning. Now, one big differentiator we found was, and which is really interesting for me as a researcher, is digital skills. TQ, which is technology quotient, who had access to better digital skills and who felt that that is enabling them to be more successful at work. The other thing they had was better social relationships, stronger bonds at work. Another one, which is work-life enhancement, which is more or less work-life balance, because these are workers who are getting the right energy and identity also outside of work. Now, looking at the organizational resources, these for these workers, they said that their organization is agile, their organization is technology to keep people safe. They're thinking about data privacy and data collection in a very strategic manner. These are organizations have really strong healthcare policies. Their organization was very quick in responding to the pandemic. Their organization supports vaccine, which is hugely important in today's time. Their organization is digitally mature. And last but not the least, their leadership is very supportive. Now, what is the business case for this mindset, right? Why do organizations need to invest in Productive Anywhere Group? Now, our research uncovered these compelling stats. 63% of high growth companies, these are companies who are projecting 10% or higher revenue growth over the next 3 years, have already enabled hybrid workforces. And on the flip side, if you look at the data, 69% of negative or no growth companies are still focused on where people are going to work and are still stuck in the debate or the dialogue around location. In the end, in the interest of time, I'd just like to conclude by saying on the next slide that it's about time to rethink how we can best support our workers. It's about time to rethink the post-pandemic worker-employer relationship. It's important to get the trust equation right. It's important to recognize that the discussion should no longer be about places and spaces. It is about potential. It is about ensuring that your workers feel energized, feel productive, feel healthy at the workplace. And from whatever we've seen so far, I think these personal and organizational resources are the ones who are winning. So in order to lead in the future of work, I think we need to move beyond the approaches that have worked in the past, because going forward, people need to be at the center of how, where, and why we work. And that's going to be the key to success. I'd like to pause there. Thank you.
Professor Jose Maria Barrero of the ITAM, again a prestigious university in Mexico City, and also the author of a very fine paper about the situation in the United States. And with that, over to you, Professor Barrero.
Oh, yeah, thanks very much. I think you should all see my slides now. Is that correct? So I want to talk today about the big shift to working from home, and so just to be totally clear, this is what I'm going to show you today is really coming from this paper that Scott has referenced about why working from home will stick, with my co-authors Nick Bloom and Steve Davis. So this contains some more recent evidence because we've been collecting data than what you see in the paper. And also I'd like to take this opportunity to refer you to our project website, wfhresearch.com, for regular updates, media coverage, and basically all our research output as long as you're interested. So I want to make two key takeaways today. And so I think a bunch of our research in this project, it coincides very much with what we've heard today from Scott and Mamta. But these are the two key takeaways that I want to give you today based on our evidence that is coming from the US. The first is that working from home is going to amount for something like 28% of full paid working days after the end of the pandemic. And this is based on our most recent data from March, just a month ago. This is up from 5% before COVID. So it's a huge jump, but also we've seen kind of a positive drift in the amount of working from home since the start of 2021. So kind of increasingly more and more people say that their employer is planning for them to work from home. And yeah, and as has said before today, hybrid is going to be about twice as popular as fully remote. And so we can discuss a little bit about why that is and how that works. The second key takeaway that I want to give you is that that there are consequences to the persistent shift to working from home. And today I'm going to show you evidence of two of those consequences. So the first is about pay equivalent, is that this shift to working from home provides pay equivalent benefits to workers, and especially workers at higher incomes. And the second is that we project that it's going to drive an increase in efficiency in the US economy by up to 3.8%. And much of this actually is coming from time savings. I'm not sure how much time I'm going to have to talk about that, but I'll be sure to happy to talk about that in the Q&A as well. So I don't think I have the time to go through all the details in this slide, but the data that I'm going to be talking about is from the survey of working arrangements and attitudes that we've been running with my co-authors, and this is a joint project with Chicago ITAM, MIT, and Stanford. We've been running this on a monthly basis since May 2020, and we survey 5,000 people in the US a month. We're trying to get a picture of kind of the broad working age population that is closely attached to the labor market. So we have an earnings threshold, but we focus on the working age population, and we reweight to match kind of the current population survey in the US for representativeness. And kind of each survey once a month has about 60 questions per wave, ranging from kind of standard stuff like demographics all the way to questions about how much you're working from home, how much your employer wants you to work from home after the pandemic, and kind of what your perspectives and experiences while working from home have been like. But the question that I want to focus on today for much of my remarks is the following one. And by the way, this is the 2021 version of the question. So before we were in 2022, we were asking every month, after COVID in 2022 and later, how often is your employer planning for you to work full days at home? With the answers ranging from never or rarely all the way to 5 days a week, or my employer hasn't really told me anything. And so when we track this across time, basically we extract the answers from that question and we translate them into a share of full paid working days, a percent of full paid working days that people say that their employer is going to want them to work from home after the pandemic. This is what we get. And so the gray line at the bottom shows you what the trajectory looks like for all workers. And the blue line, the blue dotted line shows you what this looks like for workers who are able to work from home, as revealed by them having worked from home at some point during the pandemic. And so you can see that in 2020, not a lot happens. Kind of there's no clear trend in the series. But since the start of 2021, basically both of these numbers have been rising ever since. So as the pandemic has dragged on, employers and employees have realized that kind of the future of work includes a working from home component. And that's why kind of there's been this upward drift, both for all workers and for those who are able to work from home. And as I said at the beginning, kind of for workers who are able to work from home, for all workers, we expect something like 28% of all paid working days will be done from home after the pandemic. For those who are able to, it's going to be more like 45%. So out of every 2 paid working days, which is, if you think about it, is a huge amount for kind of people in not highly paid knowledge jobs. And this is going to echo some of the remarks earlier as well. If we look at kind of what people's plans looked like in the first quarter of 2022, so this is basically what we get. So there's a large share of the economy, some 55 to 60%, who work in jobs that are basically not really immediate at all. So these people are on site. And then of the people who are going to do any working from home, those that are going to be in a hybrid setup, according to our data, so these are people who come into the office part of the week and stay home for part of the week, that there's about twice as many people in hybrid as those who will be in fully remote. And so I always stress this point because so earlier in the pandemic, there were lots of announcements and lots of speculation in the media about allowing workers to work from home forever. And so it turns out that for the majority of people, from home forever really means some form of hybrid, more so than kind of retiring to a small town in the woods and never stepping into the office. That's a kind of a small minority of people who are in the situation, even though I think we've also seen a huge jump in the amount of full working from. Now, as for what are the consequences of this big shift to working from home that we're seeing, so the first one that I want to give you again is it has to do with what this means for workers. And basically, what we find in our data, and we've tried to elicit this in several ways and get similar answers, is that working from home is a perk for workers. So when we ask people, do you value the option to work from home a couple of days a week as something equivalent to a pay raise or equivalent to a pay cut or neither, kind of many more people say that it's equivalent to a pay raise. And kind of when we follow up with the quantity of a pay raise that this is equivalent to, we get the chart on the left. So clearly there's many more people who view working from home positively as a perk of the job rather than those who view it negatively. And sure, there's a big number who don't seem swayed either way, but anyway, this clearly is a benefit for workers. And so if we shift to an economy in which we have more working from home, then this means more benefits for workers. The catch, however, is that this perk of working from home is going to be very unevenly distributed. So what this chart is showing is for every category of income that we have in our data, ranging from $10,000 to $20,000 a year, all the way to more than $250,000 a year, how much do the workers in that category want to work from home? Those are the black circles. And how much are their employers planning for them to work from home? And so here it's kind of very clear that working from home is popular. People, again, view it as a perk. And so kind of throughout the income distribution, people want to work from home something like 2 days a week. And there's a little bit of a gradient as you move up the income distribution. But when we look at what employers are planning, we see that the gradient is much steeper. And actually for people who have relatively lower earnings between say $10,000 and $50,000 a year, there's a big gap between the amount of working from home they want and the amount that their employer is planning to give them. And so this clearly shows that basically there's a hugely uneven distribution in who's going to get the perk of working from home. And you basically have to be above $250,000 a year to get as much as you want. Okay, so this is the big implication for workers. The second big implication has to do with efficiency or productivity. And so we get at this in a couple of different ways in our survey, but the most basic one is the following. It's based on a question that asks people, how efficient are you while working from home relative to working at the office? And sure, a large number of people say that it's about the same, but 43%, almost as many, say that they're more efficient at home than at the office. And that's a comparatively large number relative to those who say that they're less efficient while working from home. Okay. And actually kind of something that's really interesting is this relative efficiency has increased over time. So what we have here is for every month that we've asked this question since the fall of 2020, what is the average relative efficiency of working from home? And you can see these are all positive numbers. So there's higher efficiency while working from home as reported by people in our data. But again, we see kind of this pattern where in 2020, early on in the pandemic, there's kind of no clear trend. It's kind of messy. And then in 2021, this increases, and there seems to have been a blip in early 2022, but still kind of by the end of 2021, people are reporting that they're more efficient while working from home at 2 or 3 percentage points higher than they used to at the beginning of the pandemic. So it looks like people, as the pandemic has dragged on, they've gained working from home experience. They've learned how to do it effectively. And so now they're kind of even more efficient while doing it. When we ask people, where are these efficiency gains coming from? I should say kind of by far the most popular thing is to say that they're coming from saved commuting time. So it's the fact that if you don't spend 40 minutes going to the office and 40 minutes coming back, you can arrange your day more efficiently and sort of get more done in a day. This is more popular than having a quiet home or less stress or any of these other possibilities that we gave them. And so we think this is a big part of where the efficiency gains are coming from. So I think I'm running out of time, but basically, so I don't have the time to spend the detail to show you the details of these calculations, but when this is all said and done, and so we take into account both the amount of time saved and how that translates into efficiency gains when you're not commuting, plus kind of any innate benefits of working from home, any innate benefits to efficiency, that is, of working from home relative to the office, we project that productivity in the US economy could rise by as much as something like 3.8%, which is for the US economy, for a one-time shift is a pretty big. So let me leave it there. In our paper, in our work, we also delve a lot into the mechanisms for why we're going to see this persistent shift into working from home. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that during the Q&A. And again, if you're interested in this, I encourage you to look at wfhresearch.com, where we have all of our research output, results summaries, media coverage, etc.
Your paper. So this is really good stuff. I very much appreciate it. Thank you. Now, with that, I'd like to move on to my Bruegel colleague, Laura Nursky, who, among other things, heads a project parallel to mine on the future of work, and she'll be covering really kind of a counterpoint to a lot of what we've heard. So with that, over to you, Laura. Figure 10 minutes. Take your 10 minutes.
Having me. It's a pleasure. In your report, you cover many important elements to understand the shift to work from home. If I could also have my slides up on the screen, then I wanted to a little bit on the occupational differences, which already also Scott mentioned, and actually Professor Barrero also hinted towards when he showed the differences across the income distribution, and also Mamta mentioned this. So I want to dive deeper a little bit into this puzzle. So this is the slide that that Scott already showed us. It shows here in dark red the theoretical possibility of teleworking across 9. Clearly that even in theory, so not looking at actual teleworking, but just looking at what the possibilities of conducting these tasks from home, we see already that the teleworkability is concentrated really in the left half of the employment distribution. Just for reference, the first 4 groups, so managers, professionals, technicians, and clerks, they constitute in Europe about half of the workforce. So you see that the half of the workforce holds most of the teleworkability or the potential for telework. Then when we look at actual teleworking before the pandemic, we see that the actual uptake of telework was even more concentrated. So the bulk of teleworking was taken up by managers and professionals before the pandemic. And I think the difference between the teleworkability and the actual uptake of telework is most striking for this group of clerks. So what are clerks? Clerks are people that do administrative tasks, usually in back office environments, back office sales administration, customer service administration. We also have receptionists in there. So many of those tasks could in theory be done remotely, but we saw actually very little uptake of telework before the pandemic. And like Mamta already hinted towards this when she mentioned that people lower in the hierarchy tended to telework less, we can see this very clearly for this group of people. Also the authors of the studies, Sostero et al., they call this a hierarchy bias or a hierarchy effect. So why do I want to show this? I want to move the discussion from teleworkability and flexibility to the higher level of job quality. So job quality is a concept that includes flexibility, but also includes many other aspects like your physical environment, your social environment, your contractual conditions, but most importantly, your job content. So the tasks you do on a daily basis, how much you're being challenged, how much growth opportunities you have, the decision-making power you have, and how much autonomy you have. A lot of those resources that Mamta mentioned in the presentation, they go into the content, the job content bucket. So I'm going to show you a few scores that aggregate all these elements of job quality into a score that indicates if this is a high quality or low quality job. And this is based on a really big survey that's run in Europe every 5 years by Eurofound. 65% of those fall into the category of high quality jobs, and it goes down to 50% for professionals, below 40% for technicians. And then when we get to the clerks, there's only about 15% of workers left that give responses to this survey that put them in the high quality job category. When we look at low quality jobs, we see the opposite distribution. So most of the low quality jobs are half of this graph. And of course, this correlates with earnings because earnings is also a part of job quality. You can see clearly that the high quality jobs are also the ones that have the highest earnings. So I'm going to be really quick about this in the interest of time, just to show you that there are other technological factors at play here that are also very correlated with the occupation. For example, the risk of automation. It also mirrors the teleworkability. So the occupations in the right half are much more exposed to automation than the occupations on the left. But I'm going to be finishing actually with this slide because it allows me to make the link to what Mamta was saying about providing the right resources to people in the organization so that they can be healthy and productive wherever they work. One of those resources she mentioned was autonomy or decision-making power, the influence you have over the methods of your work, the pace of your work, how you can shape the way your organization functions. I'm going to show you a measure of that decision-making power on the y-axis, so on the vertical axis. On the right-hand side axis, I have a measure that proxies for the demands you have at work. So it's called work intensity index. So it measures how much work you have to do, but also how much your pace of work is determined by machines or by algorithms or by other people in your organization. So it's kind of a measure of how much pressure people are on. And when Mamta said that she was surprised that it was actually what differed between the two groups, the ones who could be anywhere, productive anywhere versus the ones who couldn't, she said she was surprised to see it was those resources that made the difference between those groups. Well, I wasn't surprised at all. There's a very well-established link in the scientific literature that shows that one of the main drivers for engagement are exactly those personal resources like autonomy. So let's see how those resources are actually distributed in organizations. So we have On the top right, managers, of course, they have a very intense job. They are all the way on the right, on the x-axis, but they also have a lot of decision-making power, so they have sort of resources to cope with those demands. Then we get to the professionals. This includes research professionals like me, but also ICT professionals, legal professionals, also healthcare professionals like doctors and nurses. And they're kind of in a sweet spot, I would say, based on this graph. They have less work-intensive jobs, but still a lot of decision-making power, a lot of autonomy, a lot of those personal resources and organizational resources that Mamta mentioned. For the group of associate professionals, they are in a less favorable position. They have a little bit more intense jobs and less decision-making power, but still good. They're still above that diagonal that indicates whether their job is balanced or not. But then we get to the clerks. If you remember the clerks, that was that group who had very high teleworkability in theory, but who weren't allowed to telework from home before. You can see very clearly here that they also don't have those resources from the organization to make those decisions in their job. But still on the diagonal, and it gets a bit worse than for the next group. So when we get to the service and sales workers, they drop down the diagonal. So they have the same intensive job as the clerical support workers, but with half a standard deviation less of decision-making power. Even worse for the crafts and trades related workers, because you can see they have actually the same job demands in quantitative numbers expressed as those professionals and technicians, but they have 2 standard deviations less of decision making or autonomy in their work. The plant and machine operators, even less. They are really tied to the pace that the machine sets. From their job, they don't have received a lot of resources to influence that. And then finally, we have the elementary occupations all the way at the bottom. So I was thinking of how to conclude my presentation, and I was actually so happy to be able to refer back to Mamta, because she said it in such a way that I don't think I can do any better. So I'm just going to reinforce what she said. So it's not about where we work, it's about what we do. And about people's potential. So to realize that potential, people need the right resources, so that autonomy and those organizational resources at the individual level and at the organizational level in order to be productive and healthy. And it's actually up to employers to make sure that people have those resources that they need. So when we think about redesigning jobs in the future of work, we should keep that in mind to make sure that people across all these occupations have the right resources that they need to be healthy and productive, regardless of where they work, in the office, at home, or hybrid. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Laura, for these, once again, very thoughtful comments. That's really fascinating data. Okay, well, now with that, we have a few minutes, miraculously, for question and answer. And we have a number of questions that have been posed on the Slido. We actually also have some comments in the Slido. Those of you who can look at it might enjoy reading those. I'm not going to take the time to read them for you. One question that we get is from Sarah, which is, how have caregivers, mostly women, been affected by the shift to remote work? What is the effect on the gender gap for pay, promotion, and even mental health? I put up a little data on that. I have a bit more. What do the other panelists here have? Professor Barrero, maybe?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think, so it might be a little bit early to tell about this, to be honest. I think we need to have a few years of data and see how the new working post-pandemic, or the new working arrangements after the pandemic actually turn out. What we do see in the data is that women want to work from home more than men, but they say that their employers are less likely to give it to them than men. So I'm not sure what the underlying reasons for one or the other are, but kind of in the data we see this. And one potential issue is that if working arrangements are such that employers allow workers to choose how many days to come into the office, and then say women start to come into the office less often than men, they might get less visibility with their manager and might end up getting less promoted less often than men, which could be an issue. I don't think we have any clear evidence that this is happening, but based on what we see and what people prefer, it looks like this is a potential issue that I think firms need to be careful with.
Yes, actually work in Europe by Eurofound also expressed the concern, but I haven't seen any substantiation for it. One bit that they actually have data on is that it turns out that women tend to have less savings than men, and therefore are probably more vulnerable. So this is an issue. Mamta, Laura, did either of you have something to add here?
Yes, I just wanted to add one small point there. First of all, I completely concur with Professor Barreiro's insight there. Even our survey told us that women prefer to work remotely. And obviously it has its own consequences. But we did another piece of research, which is called Better to Belong, where we looked at the different categories and was focused on inclusion and diversity, which kind of uncovered that if organizations are able to get the everyday experiences of women right, like small moments that matter, right from onboarding to their day-to-day operations, they could unlock 4.7 times their potential, which I think the opportunity is so huge that it cannot be ignored. Just wanted to table that.
Thank you, Mamta. And Laura, you had something, I think.
On the mental health, you already mentioned in your slides that especially women with kids under 12 suffered from the work from home shift. But I wanted to comment on the promotion aspect, because we know also from research that being visible at the office influences your chances for promotion. And in that sense, workers kind of compete for the attention of their manager. So the more you are at the office, the more of that attention you can get. So yes, there will be a risk for women in their promotion chances if they work from home more often than men, which they might choose to do if they have these care responsibilities. On the other hand, we've been talking a lot about how employers have to move in the way that they evaluate people. And also regarding promotion, they have to be aware that in a hybrid setting, that they shouldn't fall for this presence bias. And I think if employers can cope with that, they can find new ways to make sure that promotion chances aren't hampered by working from home. Yeah.
Good thoughts. Okay, I think I'm going to try to squeeze in one last question. We've talked about this some anyway. This one comes from Lucy Williams. It's, by the way, the previous question was from Sarah. This one's from Lucy Williams. It's, since the shift to working from home is technology-driven, won't it increase the equality gap? How do the EU and the US compare? Now, you've already talked about that a fair bit, I think. Mamta, do you have thoughts on this?
So I don't have data handy for that, Scott, but I'd just like to make a small point there. So we've been looking at this for some time now, and we found that it could unlock huge potential if this is taken seriously. And even for some categories, as I talked about women, but if we, for instance, look at racial and ethnic minorities, the data tells us that it could unlock 4 times more potential of these category of workers if they are paid attention to, if their work experience is improved. Similarly, for LGBTQ communities, it could unlock 3.7 times their potential if organizations pay a little more attention on creating that sense of belonging, improving their work experience. So that's what I would share at the moment. Yeah.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. And Professor Barreiros, do you have any thoughts on this? You have data on almost everything. You probably do.
Yeah, so on this concept of equality, so I think I gave a pretty dire warning for what working from home might mean for equality, because we do see that kind of the people who are going to get this benefit are going to be disproportionately higher earning and highly educated. I think what's a bigger question, and I don't have a great data answer for this in the long term, is whether this ability to do more remote work is going to allow us to kind of shift the way work is done so that there can be more high-paying jobs, say, away from big cities, and providing kind of job opportunities not just for the remote workers, but for kind of the in-person services and the rest of the economy at these more quote unquote remote locations, or say, for example, when you're talking about women who are or people who are less attached to the labor market, like it might be women with young children, it might be people with disabilities. Maybe the ability to do a remote job is going to be able to pull them back into the labor force and give them better opportunities than they used to have before the pandemic. I think we're going to have to wait a couple of years to see how this kind of really pans out, but that's kind of the flip side of the coin. In the short term, it doesn't look so good because of who's going to get to work from home in the short term, but in the long term, it might reallocate kind of where and what sorts of jobs are available and for whom.
Thank you so much for that. And Laura, I think you've already pretty much given your answer, yes? Mm-hmm. So we are just exactly at our desired closing time, and this is, I think, a pretty perfect time to close. I'd like to first note that this has been a day of firsts. The paper that I presented was for the Transatlantic Expert Group, our first paper. This is the first workshop that the group is presenting. And also, coincidentally, this is the first hybrid workshop that Bruegel is presenting from our not brand new, but from our event studio that's been substantially enhanced. So a day of firsts. I'd like to express my deeply felt appreciation to our wonderful speakers. I think this has been an absolutely great session. Thank you so much for taking the time and for giving us such well-prepared and thoughtful remarks. And with that, I think we can close. Thanks to all of you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.